Hello and welcome to today's WorkSafe Month webinar, Creating a Mentally Healthy Workplace Starts With You. What, why and how. I'm Stephanie Morawski from WorkSafe Tasmania and I will be your moderator. Before we start, please take a moment to read the following slide about information received today. I'll now go over housekeeping. Here is a screenshot of the attendee control panel. You should see something that looks like this on the right hand of your screen. You're likely listening in using your computer speaker system by default. If you would prefer to listen over the phone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. Webcams and audience microphones will not be used in today's webinar. Questions will be taken throughout the presentation. Please use your control panel to type and submit your questions. An attendee handout is now also available for download via your handouts pane. Finally, today's webinar is being recorded. I would now like to introduce your presenter, Wendy French, Managing Consultant from Talking About Training. Recognised nationally as the recipient of the 2017 National Life Award for Excellence in Suicide Prevention and 2016 Tasmanian Government Life Award for Outstanding Contribution, Wendy is a sought-after speaker presenting at numerous national and international conferences and forums. With a strong belief that mentally healthy workplaces play a vital part in people's overall well-being, Wendy developed the Talking About suite of training programs incorporating the successful Company Champions program, which is committed to helping organisations, individuals and communities learn about how to maintain their mental health and to recognise and respond to those impacted by mental health problems, suicide and suicide loss. Welcome, Wendy.
Hello, Stephanie, and thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. Can everybody hear? I hope so. I'm really sorry that in current circumstances we can't meet face to face, but thanks for signing in today. It's an important and timely topic that we're going to cover, and quite a big topic. So well done for fronting up on a Friday afternoon for that. Currently, with an estimated 1 in 6 people of working age experiencing a mental illness, and with what's happening more broadly in the world, sorry, I've just skipped forward a bit, but that's okay. Mental health's really an increasingly important topic in the workplace, but there's often a gap in understanding what mental health is and what mental illness is, and what's the role of the workplace in that space. So I'm going to spend a little time today on talking about what we mean by those terms before I get to talking about the role of the workplace in addressing mental health and safety. And it's important that we are on the same page. So I'm also going to briefly touch on some of the relevant laws that you'll need to be familiar with and some of the more common risks in the workplace as well. We're also going to look at taking an approach to developing some strategies that might help you to develop a mentally healthy workplace at the same time. So as you can see on the screen there, safety at work, you know, there's been for some time now an increasing focus on improving health and safety in Australian workplaces, and owing to this increased work, we've seen a decrease, I guess, in workplace accidents and injuries as a result. But the safety that's referred to in the Workplace Health and Safety Act, that actually refers not only to keeping the body safe, but it also encompasses psychological safety. And under this law, that means that steps have to be taken to ensure that the working environment doesn't harm an individual's mental well-being or aggravate an existing condition. Now, my dad, he was a World War II veteran, and he spent most of his working life after the war at the Railton cement factory driving a crane, and he used to go off to work every day in his khaki or navy blue overalls, and not a bit of fluoro to be seen, very little PPE. But we've legislation now that really requires that as employers, we provide a safe working environment, and as employees, we've also got a responsibility to work safely, to keep an eye out for risks, and to notify hazards. And that can encompass our psychological safety. Now, just as since my Father's Day, we've learnt that we need to be seen to be safe. Do you know what to look for, how to recognise if somebody is experiencing a mental health issue or if they're at risk? And if you do you know what to do about it? So today we're going to talk about a few strategies that you might find helpful, because we're all responsible, each one of us, under the workplace health and safety legislation. It is a two-way street. So why some of the reasons why it's so important, apart from the legal factors, let's just take a look at some of the statistics here. And I guess there would be very few of you that wouldn't answer yes to this question. Do you want you and your workers to be thriving and healthy and safe? Well, unfortunately, the research and the statistics is pretty much stacked against you. Many people feel that mental illness is rare, something that only happens to people with life situations that are very different from their own, that will never affect them. But in reality, there'd be few Australian families that'd be untouched by mental illness. And likewise, there'd be few workplaces also. 1 in 5 Australians in ordinary times are deemed to have an existing mental illness. So that's quite common. And 45% of us in our lifetime will experience at least one episode of mental illness. Psychological conditions, they destroy lives, they can complicate relationships, and they can cost businesses. Oops, sorry. I've just lost my place there. I'm sorry, Stephanie, I think I've just lost the webinar.
I can pull the next few up.
There we go, I've got you back. Yep. So sorry, I don't know what I did there. Technology is not my strong point. I'm better at mental health information than I am technology. My apologies. Okay, so I've got you back. So poor mental health costs Australian businesses $10 billion per annum when it's left unchecked. 6% of workers' compensation claims are attributable to mental stress. So that's a pretty high number. Workers' comp, we know that work-related mental health conditions, psychological injuries, have become a major concern. The negative impact on individual employees, the claims for workers' compensation involving mental health conditions are usually associated with above average time off work and higher than average claim costs. For example, a typical compensation claim payment, $24,500 for a mental health claim compared to $9,000 for other claims, 15.3 weeks off work as an average for mental health claims compared to 5.5 weeks for other claims. So you can see it has a significant impact in the workplace. In a recent workplace study, it was interesting that 74% of people reported that they felt stressed at work. And yet in that same survey, 50% of managers thought that they would never be required to manage somebody with a mental health condition. So not really a realistic expectation. 50% to 60% of all workplace absenteeism is estimated to be associated with poor mental health. And that's absenteeism, but what about presenteeism? That's what we can't always gauge. And what I mean by presenteeism is where the employee turns up to work, but their mind's not on task. They're not focused, not able to focus on what they're doing. And that's a safety issue. The elevated rates of anxiety and depression. Okay, there we go. Elevated rates of anxiety and depression for people, for male people working in male-dominated industries, indicate that there's a lot of workers out there who are experiencing poor mental health. So there's good evidence that shows that where a workplace-based mental health program can play a significant role, it can also have a really good cost benefit if it's done well. But unfortunately, lack of knowledge can mean that workplaces avoid dealing with it. But unfortunately, as we see there, we just can't afford to do that anymore. We need to get on top of it. So why creating a mentally healthy workplace? Well, it makes good business sense, as we've just seen. Before I started working in mental health and suicide prevention, I worked for many years in recruitment, and one of my roles was a state manager of a national recruitment company that would be known to many of you. Now, we had workers on sites where we didn't actually have physical control over their environment. And our failure to manage workers' safety, that led to a blowout in workers' compensation insurance premiums to a point where fundamentally the whole business was in jeopardy. So we had to scramble, we had to introduce some rigorous safety protocols, and ultimately it changed the way that labour hire companies work. We're really at that same point now with psychological safety. An unhealthy work environment or a workplace incident can cause considerable stress, and it can exacerbate or contribute to the development of a mental illness that can impact on a worker's whole life. And as we just saw under workplace health and safety legislation, there is an onus on the employer to make sure that the workplace and the conditions of the workplace and the role don't exacerbate or contribute to the development of mental illness. So recognising and responding to that risk early can lessen the chances of mental health problems, and it can help to prevent mental health illness. But also there are some legal requirements that workplaces have to meet. It's actually the law to take that into account. As an employer, there are legal obligations in relation to the management of mental illness in the workplace, and these 4 areas of legislation are relevant to managing pretty much any issue that might arise in relation to an employee who's affected by poor mental health or mental illness. Workplace health and safety, which we've just spoken about, each state has its own legislation. But within the Disability Act, there's a requirement for policies that spell out your organisation's position on mental health and the support structures that you have in place for those who experience a mental health symptom. So if somebody's got a mental health condition that has a substantial or long-term adverse effects on their ability to perform their normal day-to-day activities, they're deemed to have a disability. And that Disability Discrimination Act says that employers can't discriminate against workers with a disability, including mental health conditions. Employers are also required to make reasonable adjustments where possible to meet the needs of workers with mental health conditions. And we're going to look at that in a little bit more detail later on. Fair Work, the Fair Work Act, also includes restrictions around making sure that employers are protected from any discrimination because of their mental health condition. The Privacy Act also comes into play, letting your people know that you have policies in place that protect their privacy, as well as protecting them from discrimination due to any mental health issues. That really needs to be communicated. So as a result, when a worker discloses that they have a mental illness, that information shouldn't be disclosed without their consent. Now, you can usually only use that information for the purpose they disclosed it to you for. So, for example, to seek some adjustments to their work or to deal with their mental health issue. There might be some exceptions to that, depending on the particular legislation, including where the use of information is necessary. For example, if the person's at imminent risk to their safety or another person, or where that information might be required to be used by law, for example, in workers' compensation claims, superannuation, sick leave, and so forth. And the Fair Work Act, as I mentioned, that does provide protection. The Fair Work Ombudsman, that's a pretty good source of reference, and that office would much rather be contacted for advice than mediation. They do provide an advice service. The Human Rights Commission also has relevant information that's helpful, as does WorkSafe. But as employers, you do need to be aware of what your obligations are under these laws. So when we understand mental health, and then we can really understand how best to manage it in the workplace. So before we look at creating a mentally healthy workplace, I think it's important that we're on the same page when we're talking about what is mental health. So I just wonder, Stephanie, if I could ask you if you just pop up our first poll up on screen at the moment for me. Poll number 1.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. So how prepared do you feel to recognise and assist someone at risk of or experiencing a mental health problem? Not at all prepared, partly prepared, mostly, or well prepared?
We'll close the poll shortly.
Good home.
I'll close the poll, Wendy, and share the results.
Thank you. Thanks. Okay, so that's good. Mostly prepared, 40%, partly prepared, 45%. That's quite a good result. But there's always room for improvement, isn't there? Because at some time it's a given that if you're managing people, you will need to have a conversation of care with somebody around their mental health. So again, that can be learned. So thank you, Stephanie. We'll get rid of that. So that just gives me an idea of how much to spend on the next few slides as well. So a mentally healthy workplace is more than, it's not just about managing illness. It's really about helping our people to maintain their wellness or their well-being. Now, researchers who contribute to the World Health Organization have determined that these areas that you see on the screen now, they are the 7 dimensions of well-being that need to be addressed within the workplace and in life. I call these the creeks and gullies in that river of life that flow into where we work, where we live, where we play. To keep that river flowing smoothly, we need these creeks and gullies to be managed and to be flowing smoothly. If any of these domains are out of balance, it can impact our well-being, and that can be physical or mental. Now, this is the stuff that matters, and this is what we all bring to work with us. So how do you manage your own stress? On the screen now, you'll see a wellbeing self-test, and this you can download. I think this is the handout that you're able to download, or you can go to the website that you see there and download. This is a printable PDF. And I would encourage you to take some time out after the webinar, just spend 2 minutes to go through and have a little assessment, a self-assessment. How are you feeling yourself? How long ago was it that before you actually sat down and stopped to think about, how am I travelling? This can be a useful tool also for you to use with your teams. I have one company that uses this as a tool to introduce the topic at their staff safety meetings. Each staff member does a wellbeing self-assessment before they kick off the meeting, and it just allows the conversation to start in a safe way. So take some time out, and on the website as well, and on the printable version, it will give you some instructions as to what you can do next, depending on what your score might be. So mental health problems, mental health and physical health, let's just talk about that for a minute, because I think sometimes there can be a little bit of misunderstanding about what does the term mental health actually mean. And just as we have physical health, and that's different to physical illness, so too mental health can be different to mental illness. Mental just simply means of the mind, and we all have mental health, and just like physical health, that can be good health, it can be poor health, or it can be ill health, and that can change at various times in our life. Poor mental health, that's a pretty common human experience, you know, unrelenting stress, adverse life events, rumination, going back over past events, negative emotions. They can all contribute to poor mental health, and if they go unaddressed, it can make us more susceptible to mental illness, just the same as poor physical health can make us more susceptible to physical illness. But a physical illness, a mental illness rather, is a general term, and it refers to a group of illnesses pretty much in the same way that heart disease refers to a group of illnesses and disorders that affect the heart. And you'll see on the screen there some of the more common mental illnesses, and in the order of prevalence that we see them present in society. But a mental illness is a diagnosable health problem that significantly affects how a person's able to think, how they feel, behave, their emotions, and how they interact with other people. Now, again, mental illnesses can vary in severity. It can be severe in some cases, mild in others. It can be transitory. Sometimes it might cause ongoing disability that might need longer term support. So while a number of the symptoms of these illnesses can be similar, each illness affects a person's thoughts, their feelings and their behaviours in very distinct ways. And again, there's no blood test that can actually determine or diagnose a mental illness, so sometimes it requires perseverance to get the right diagnosis. It can be important for the clinician to observe the patient over a period of time to understand the mental illness and the effects on the person's life. And that can have ramifications for the workplace. It can require quite a deal of patience while the person is working through that process. And it pays to be interested and supportive. Let the person know that you're supporting them in that process. There are only 3 mental health professionals who can diagnose a mental illness. Can you think of who they might be? Now, if you're thinking a GP, a psychiatrist, and a clinical psychologist, then you're right. A GP and a psychiatrist, they are both medical professionals, they're both medical doctors with different areas of speciality. They are the only 2 health professionals who can prescribe medication. Clinical psychologists will work more with various therapies. But it pays to know that treatment and support is available, and being familiar with what's available can be helpful as well. Now, this website that I'm just putting up on the screen now, headtohealth.gov.au, I recommend that as a pretty good go-to portal for information about those major disorders, what they involve, some of the signs, some of the symptoms, and also some of the treatments and the services that are available for treatment. So that can be quite a good handy resource for you also. It's interesting also to know that mental health problems are the 3rd biggest health problem in Australia after heart disease and cancer. So it's often a lot more common than people think. Mental illness isn't about weakness or character. It's about biological processes that make the brain work. And they are changed when the person has a mental illness. Scientists are learning that mental illness is really associated with changes in the brain structure, in the chemistry and its function. And mental illness does indeed have a biological basis. It's not just a figment of somebody's imagination. And that's important to understand. Our brain's a pretty complex organ, you know. It only takes up about 2% of our total body weight, but it actually consumes 20% of all the oxygen that we breathe and 20% of all the energy that we ingest as well. But it controls everything. Hundreds of thousands of chemical reactions occur every second in the brain, and those reactions underlie all of us, basically, our thoughts, our actions, our behaviours. In short, it dictates our internal processes and behaviours that allow us to survive. So on the screen, you'll see that little diagram that you're looking at there. That shows us what we call neurons in the brain. They're fine invisible strands. Each of us have between 80 to 100 billion of these little strands in our brain. And they transmit electrical signals and chemical messages in a process called neurotransmission. Now, most scientists believe that mental illness results from problems with the communication between these neurons in the brain, the neurotransmission, so either nerve damage or chemical changes, an imbalance, so either too much, too little, or maybe the wrong ones. And a bit like a computer that short circuits, the electronic impulses may not be connecting, so the information might not be transmitting in the right way. So just as too much insulin can make us diabetic, too few neurotransmitters or damage to those little neurons can make us depressed. So a lot of things that can alter the chemical imbalance, we're going to look at a few of those in a moment, but what we eat, how much stress, trauma, for example. Now, trauma can change our brain in a heartbeat. When those little neurons fire together, they can wire together, and that can change your brain straight away. So it's a process that's so complicated, it's really not a surprise that scientists still don't fully understand what causes mental illness. But the answers lie really in the circumstances in which we're born, in which we grow, live, work, and age. They'll either enable us to thrive or they don't. And we do know that certain things can increase a person's risk of developing a mental illness. So biological risk factors, things to do with the body that you can see there on the screen, psychological factors, how you interpret things, the meaning that you make, the self-talk, the things that you tell yourself. Your brain believes everything you tell it. And if we get a chance to meet in person, I'll prove that to you. Social risk factors, family life experiences, parental discord, death of a family member, peer groups, isolation, all of those things, trauma again, can all exacerbate risk. Now, adverse events can take a toll. When you've got a number of bad things that happen to you, it doesn't matter how much you want to stay strong and cope. If enough weight is added, piled on, the strongest of us will inevitably buckle. I just want to touch briefly on this little topic as well. How often in recent times have you heard these words? Unprecedented, challenging, difficult, uncertain times. I think I've heard unprecedented number of times this year and heartily tired of it. But it has been a very difficult year. Uncertainty. It's been hard going for us here in Australia if you think about what we faced just in a few short months. And not knowing what's going to happen next. If we, when are our borders going to be open? When will there be a vaccine? When will things return to normal? The answer is mostly we don't know. And in that uncertainty, our brain actually is based on working on making a best guess of what's going to happen next. So when it's not sure of what's going to happen next, it can make up stories, and those stories might not be so helpful. Also, as a collective, globally, we're all grieving. As we do anything that we value, when we lose what we value, we grieve it, and all of us have suffered loss. Loss of income for some, loss of freedoms, loss of sense of safety, and we're doing that globally for the first time in history. We're all impacted by bigger world events, so emotions are to the forefront for a lot of people. So we need to be forewarned is basically forearmed. Under legislation, we need to be mindful that your workplace and work conditions don't exacerbate people's conditions. Now, one positive that's come from COVID is that workplaces are demonstrating more awareness of employees' mental health, which is great. But one of the downsides is that people often are struggling with their mental health, perhaps more than normally. Now, it's often presumed that a worker's mental illness, or because of these factors, that the mental illness develops outside the workplace and that's where it resides. But it doesn't stay in those compartments, does it? It comes with us. These are the things we bring into the door to work every day. We all do. We're human. We can't avoid it. So as an employer or a manager of people, you need to minimise the risk of exacerbating or contributing to those existing stresses. So it really pays to have an idea of what's going on for your people, being curious, being interested in them, taking time to get to know what motivates them, what's going on in their lives, because that's coming to work with them. And fostering good relationships can make it easier to recognise and deal with situations as they arise as well. An unhealthy work environment or a workplace incident can cause considerable stress and can be a tipping point for the development of mental illness. Now, research indicates that job stress and other work-related hazards are emerging as leading contributors to the burden of occupational disease and injury. Now, if you look back to that earlier slide, 6% of workers' compensation claims, that's hefty on the hip pocket. It's not only going to cause disruption in the workplace, but your workers' compensation insurance premiums, all of those on factors. And the workplace is where we spend a lot of our lives, isn't it? So the first step really to creating a mentally healthy workplace is to be aware of and try and reduce these three factors where possible. Lack of value. Now, either in self or in work, that can play a part. Years ago, I worked for an international marketing company, and we did a lot of mail outs. So we were mailing out, we did a lot of order fulfillment. So we had a big factory and we mailed out literally thousands of different shaped articles every day. One day I was down in the production area and a new employee was being inducted, and his role was going to be working on a plastic wrap machine, which meant he had to fiddle with a few buttons and pull a lever. Now, that whole process to induct him into that job could have taken about 5 minutes. It's not really a highly skilled job. But the manager took that person around and he introduced him to every person in the process of the jobs that he would be doing, including me as a sales executive, talking to him about what it takes to convince a customer to come to us and what we promise in way of quality. And he took that worker along that process line and introduced him to each stage of the process and each person that conducted that part of the work. And he showed him where he fitted into that place, what his job meant, and what would happen, what were the consequences down the line if he didn't pay attention and if product wasn't wrapped properly. He gave that guy his why. He made his job valuable, and everybody had that sense of value in what they did. And it really impressed me. That's good management. letting people know the value of what they do. Poor relationships, lack of support, imbalance in job design. That might be where there's high job demand and low skills, or low job demand and somebody's overqualified. A lack of synergy between the demands on an employee and the resources that they have available to them that can assist in managing their workplace or their workload. That can all have a big impact. Occupational uncertainty, times of change. Well, I don't think that that's foreign to very many workplaces these days, is it? How many of us have surety in our work? Increasing casualisation of the workplace all plays a really big part. So reducing those risk factors, that's really just the starting point. So I'd like to, if you could, Stephanie, could you pop up poll number 2 for me? And I'd like you just to have a look at this and tick which one you think really best describes your workplace. Do you have a mental health policy and everyone knows how to access it? A mental health policy, but it's not broadly accessible? You have a mental health policy, but it's not well utilised? Or you're developing one, or you don't have one?
We'll close the poll shortly.
Thank you.
I'll close the poll, Wendy, and share the results.
Thank you. Okay, so that's quite good. 20% have a policy and know how to use it, access it. 8%, but it's not broadly accessible. 13% isn't well utilised. 15% don't, and 45% have no policy. Okay, so that's good. You know, there's some movement there. That's probably increased over what it would have been 4 or 5 years ago. There's still some room for improvement there for the mental health policies. So we're going to look now at how we might use some strategies to manage mental health in the workplace. The common assumption is that mental health problems, as we said before, are caused by home issues, and that can lead some employers to feel that it's not really appropriate or indeed even their responsibility to intervene and support staff. But just as we saw in most cases, people's mental health problems are a combination of those two things, problems they face at home and at work. So stress and these risk factors to mental health need to be managed. And again, it comes down to spotting the hazard, assessing the risk and address the risk. Same process, no different. These and other factors can all contribute to anxiety, depression, or push people towards the tipping point for mental illness. And it's up to managers and leaders to keep those in check. But organisations can often struggle to find direction on mental health because the factors involved are diverse. And lack of knowledge can mean that workplaces don't have the confidence to deal with it. But you do need to have a strategy to manage mental health because you'll have to deal with it at some time if you haven't already. So every workplace is unique and different, and your approach needs to be unique and different too. It needs to fit with what your workplace is about. The most effective way of developing a mental health strategy involves taking an integrated approach that considers and addresses these 3 key areas. It doesn't have to be huge. It can be a number of small steps across a range of areas. But an integrated approach really helps to make sure that you cover off all your bases, that your approach is effective. Firstly, in promoting the benefits of good health and safety, protecting against injury, preventing harm, and thirdly, supporting people who need it. And an integrated approach helps to get people on board right across the organisation. Promotion. Now, promotion of health and wellbeing, that's not a legislated obligation, but equipping employees with awareness, with understanding and resilience, the ability to manage stress in the workplace, they're key components of a mentally healthy workplace. But it relies on managers to take a visible role in supporting employees' mental health. Leadership's really the key here, because managers are the role models when it comes to how mental health is viewed in the workplace. You can put all your policies in place that you want, But if managers aren't visibly walking the walk, then that's not going to flow through. Just an example, fairly recently I was working with a rather large workplace that have spent considerable time and quite a lot of money on implementing a whole of organisation, workplace strategy to manage mental health and to create, I guess, culture change to a degree. And I went out to one of their remote sites, and the boss sat back in his chair and calmly informed me with legs akimbo that it was okay for me to sit up there and talk about this stuff, but he's the guy that's got to manage the nut jobs. Bang, policy out the window. All that work pretty much undone by that one statement. I wonder how safe those workers would feel to disclose to that person if they were having a problem. So again, managers need to be on board here. Managers, supervisors, it's critical that they walk the walk. Now, while a lot of employees don't hesitate to take time off work, you know, if they want to go to the doctor or the dentist, they're not so reticent to do that. But a lot of them are more likely to be shy about addressing their mental health needs. So promoting the benefits of good mental health can make it clear that you support employees' efforts to take care of their minds no less than you want them to their bodies. So you need to make it okay for employees and colleagues to tell you when they're not okay, and for them not to feel that they're going to be negatively judged or impacted either. That means that they're going to get help quicker and they're going to recover with less disruption to your business. You can make mental health tools, self-assessment tools, available to all employees. The wellbeing test that we looked at before, you can download that as a printable PDF version. If you have an EAP, an employee assistance provider, promote it widely and promote it often. Let people know it's there and how they can access it. Don't rely on that as your sole effort. You might distribute materials, so putting up brochures, posters, flyers that employees can access about the signs and symptoms of poor mental health, some of the treatment options. That can also be a good strategy to get the word out there. Preventing harm is the other key to workplace wellbeing. Now, giving employees opportunities, I guess, to participate in decisions about issues that might affect their job stress can be one way to do it. Communication's really key. And again, taking steps to help employees build mental health and resilience so they can stay as healthy as possible to prevent harm. And some simple strategies there to achieve this can be providing managers with training to help them recognise the signs and symptoms of stress and depression, encourage them to seek help from qualified mental health professionals. Mental health training has been shown to increase understanding and decrease stigma around mental health problems. I have to declare an interest. I'm a master trainer in mental health first aid, which is a widely recognised as a benchmark standard. But it educates staff about how they can maintain mental health and keep an eye out for those who might not be travelling so well. Educating your staff about mental health in the workplace, about mental health conditions, gives people information and tools to better understand if they are starting to struggle, they know what to do about it. So education and training can reduce that stigma, and it means people are more likely to speak up and seek help early before the symptoms get too severe. Identifying supporters and champions in the workplace can be another good strategy as well. Who are the people that you know, the natural helpers, the go-to people, keeping them engaged, giving them skills to recognise and respond to people. I deliver a program, Company Champions, which is a one-day course for emerging leaders and those natural helpers, to give them the skills and tools that allow them to be ears and eyes on and able to direct people to appropriate help. And the third pillar of an integrated approach is really supporting and managing illnesses and incidents as they might occur. Do you have a critical incident plan in your organisation? It's no good trying to plan for a crisis in the middle of the crisis. And there are a range of different things that can impact on the workplace. People possess really different skills, life experiences, and that can affect greatly how they react to stresses in the workplace. So providing training for supervisors to enable them to support employees with a mental health problem. The ideal is We want people to either remain in work or be able to return to work. And again, the 2-day mental health first aid course addresses that very, very well. Make a commitment to reintegrating all workers with a mental health problem and make that known to both employees and supervisors that they won't be disadvantaged if they have to have time off from mental health issue, that they'll be reintegrated exactly the same way as if they pulled a hammy on the football field on the weekend. It's no different. Understanding how to manage someone with an illness or experiencing an adverse life event which might impact on their mental health. How do we support team members? Noticing changes in people's behaviour and approaching somebody that you might be concerned about. Under workplace health and safety obligations, we have a legal obligation to speak up if we see something. See something, say something. If it's unsafe in your workplace, we can't walk past and keep your mouth shut. So if you're not confident, then learn how. And anyone can learn that. How many workplaces have first aid officers? How many have mental health first aid officers? The numbers should really correlate. And please feel free to contact me after the webinar if you'd like assistance or advice on implementing that in your workplace. It'd be a wonderful thing to see one day that we have designated mental health first aid officers in the same ratio as our physical first aid officers, because I can pretty much guarantee that those skills would be needed much more often. Important under the law, people with mental health conditions are supported regardless of the cause. So it doesn't matter whether the cause of their mental illness is at home or at work, they still need to be supported in the workplace under law. So as employers, as managers, you need to know their why. What's going on for them? What do they need? Help them to get it. They should reciprocate. But don't wait until things go bad to talk. Luckily, most mental health conditions are very treatable, and when employees can trust that you won't call them nut jobs for having a mental illness, they're more likely to and willing to seek treatment. And I mean, just as it is with physical illness, retention at work's the desired outcome. But at the end of the day, you still have to get the job done. You've still got a business to run. You've got other staff that you have to consider as well. So you can learn as managers to recognise and explore when performance issues might be resulting from a health issue, either physical or mental, and that needs to be factored in. So I guess welcome to one of the, sorry, not sure how I can take that back. There we go. As managers, you're required to create a workplace that supports the mental health of your employees, and yet at the same time running a business creates certain demands of its own, doesn't it? So because of possible fluctuations in mood and the ability for the person to process information, those things can accompany poor mental health. Employees with mental health issues can, demonstrate, I guess, poor performance difficulties at work or changes in their typical behaviour. They might have a drop in performance. Sometimes that's our first clue that all's not well. So performance management needs to be a supportive function that really examines what are the reasons for the changes or the underperformance. It should investigate the need to provide health support, either physical or mental. Is that a factor for this person? Now, while there are certain legislative requirements that usually prevent you from asking about a diagnosis, if you suspect a mental health issue, you can continue to support performance in a psychologically safe way while you're encouraging the person to seek appropriate help and feel safe to discuss whatever the issue might be. There's no need really for somebody to disclose an illness. There's no legal requirement for an employee to disclose an illness, unless the symptoms or the medication might pose a risk to them or others in the workplace, or where they know that the demands of the job might exacerbate their condition. They do have a legal obligation to disclose then. But employers have a right to ask their employees certain questions about the mental health condition for legitimate purposes. So that might be to determine whether the person can perform the inherent requirements of the job, or to identify any reasonable adjustments that might need to be made to allow them to meet those inherent requirements, or where there's a legal requirement for, like, as I said before, sick leave, workers' comp, other insurances. but you do have an obligation to provide privacy around that information that you receive. So I guess the key is really treat the mental illness as you would any physical illness. And really, as a manager, you don't need to know whether a staff member has a diagnosed mental illness. A manager's job is really to identify any issues and come up with a solution that makes the team productive. So again, consider, really needs to be considered objectively if such a condition is a contributor to your employee's conduct or performance. So I guess the rule it out first before you go down a disciplinary path. And again, the more educated you are about mental health issues, then the easier those conversations are to have and the better the outcome. And again, internal mental health promotion makes that a much smoother and more positive process for everybody as well. Now, the legality, I guess, of supporting those who experience mental health issues in the workplace really comes down to two major concepts. Firstly, can the employee meet the inherent requirements of the job? Now, what I mean by inherent requirements, these are the core components of the role, the fundamental requirements that can't be changed or altered. And number two, whether the employer makes reasonable adjustments to those requirements so that the employee can still work. Now, reasonable adjustments are changes to the job or the work environment that can be made to enable a worker to perform their duties more effectively. So in determining that, the manager really has these four key tasks. Firstly, identifying what are those core requirements of the job. And again, if you've got a job description in place, that can be a really handy guide and it can be useful for you there. Then objectively assessing the actual capabilities of the worker. Now, trust is important here, assessing the skills and abilities. If the worker's prepared to show you any medical advice or recommendations they've been given, that can assist you greatly to identify their key skills, abilities and experiences. Knowing your workers, being curious about what's going on for them, being able to communicate can make this a much easier process should it be needed. And again, this is where mental health promotion can pay really big dividends. Pardon me. And again, number three there, identifying reasonable adjustments, discussing with the person what reasonable adjustments might be required to make them available to and able to do the job properly. Now, some of these adjustments can be really simple, they can cost nothing and quite inexpensive, but it needs to be done with the workers' collaboration. So, for example, you might scale down their responsibilities or remove them from high-pressure projects for a period. But you need to be mindful there that you don't let them run the risk of losing the respect of their colleagues or undermining their confidence as well in the process. Sometimes we can be a bit enthusiastic in trying to help and we can disempower instead. So just ask the person, what do you need to allow you to get on with the job? You can develop strategies to deal with any future concerns should they arise. And the key to remember is everybody's experience of mental health is different. So two people, for example, with a diagnosis of depression, it might have very different symptoms, so they might need different adjustments. So it has to be a collaboration. Now, that might seem all very complex, but often the person's the expert on their condition. They know what their support needs do, and it comes down to managing the person as an individual. And as I say, that conversation is a straightforward way to identify what support line managers need to put in place. And again, it can be as simple as, one person I was managing with an anxiety disorder requested that I remembered to provide feedback when she submitted reports. It just prevented her from having, I guess, second guesses and talking herself into the fact that she hadn't done a good job, spiraling into distress. Very simple fix, just a simple feedback process. So the individual situation will dictate what kind of adjustments are reasonable in the circumstances. So it pays to be flexible, look at as many options as you can, and identify going forward what's going to work for the worker and for your business. Same type of process as you would if indeed it was a physical injury. So once those reasonable adjustments have been made and sufficient time has passed to let you really objectively assess whether the person has the ability to meet the core requirements, then you can determine where to from here. Can the person still do the job? Now, if an honest and a good conversation isn't forthcoming from the person, then the only route forward might be to manage it as you would any other performance problem. Or where the worker is unable to meet the inherent requirements of the job and no adjustment can be reasonably made, then you might choose to explore alternative work options, or the person might need to explore alternative employment. But ideally, managing these scenarios starts long before they appear by building in those right attitudes, the cultures around mental health in your team. That can really mitigate some of these risks, and it can make this process a whole lot less disruptive. And again, managing as you would for a physical illness, the return to work. Grant the worker enough time to recover from their injury or illness and apply a reasonable return to work plan with appropriate time frames. You need to manage the absence. That's really important, to maintain contact with the worker. Don't go silent. This can be a critical time to provide that support. One chap I know was off for some time from work with a mental health condition which involved quite a lengthy period of hospitalisation. Now, for everybody else in that workplace who's off sick, they receive a fruit basket and get well card from the company. He didn't get a fruit basket. Make sure that you don't discriminate. It's illness, whether it be physical or mental. Treat it the same. Maintain an appropriate level of regular contact in a supportive way, not when you're coming back to work, but start the dialogue early and make sure that the employee understands they have a responsibility as well to keep you informed of the reasons why they're absent from work, and when they know it, how long the absence is likely to last. So let them know their obligations around that. And again, start talking about return to work as early as possible so they know they'll be supported, and discuss the ways that that might happen, what information they might need to be provided with. You might even obtain written permission from the employee to contact their healthcare provider. That can often help in determining what reasonable adjustments might be needed. And also you need to factor in, are there any factors in the workplace that might have contributed to the person's mental health problem? So the supervisor has to really examine the work role and determine whether that's the case, whether the person's workload or situation at work might be contributing to the problem, and consider if any changes need to be made. So a return to work assessment of the job and the employee's mental health really needs to take place. If there are signs of relapse, then you'd review the processes and the options for making further adjustments, and talk realistically with the person about what's the best way to move forward here. Developing a return to work plan is really important, and that should be clearly written out and documented, and agreed by everybody who's affected. It should be flexible, adjustable, and again, for enough time to allow the person to really recover by the agreed full return to work date. Should have mentioned as well, it's not always important for the person to be 100% fully recovered to return to work, just the same as with physical illness. That can be a staged process. So monitor the plan, make sure that tasks and hours are remaining appropriate and sufficient, and that sufficient supports and resources are available. You might encourage support from other people as well. Colleagues should be encouraged to welcome back the employee who's returning after sick leave due to a mental health problem, but respectfully, not prying for details, but they shouldn't avoid talking about it either. A simple glad to have you back can be really helpful, So have a policy about returning to work as part of the broader health and wellbeing policy. Promoting awareness, a clear understanding of the policy to all employees. It should really be a part of what you do. Letting people know that policy is there to protect them. It can actually increase that sense of safety and make it more likely that they're going to tell you if they need some assistance. So look at what workplace supports or modifications might be around and available to assist that return. Under the Equal Opportunity Act, disability includes physical, psychological or neurological disease or disorder. So it's covered within that act as well. So businesses that care about good mental health and wellbeing, they attract and keep the brightest and the best, because they're good places to work, where people can feel supported and valued more than just for getting the work done. Recent research by PricewaterhouseCoopers has shown that for every $1 that your business invests in creating a mentally healthy workplace, you'll get an average return of $2.30. So it's a pretty good return on investment there. So the facts are pretty clear. As well as benefiting employees, a mentally healthy workplace is also better for your bottom line. So I know this is a big topic to cover in under an hour, and if you'd like more information about the various training programs offered, or to talk further about what you've heard today, maybe to talk about implementing mental health first aid officers in your workplace, please get in touch. You can do that through my website there. So thank you. I hope this has been some value, and I'm going to throw back to Stephanie now for any questions that might have come through.
Thank you, Wendy. So if anyone does have any questions for our presenter today, Wendy French from Talking About Training, please use the questions pane on your control panel to type and submit those questions. And just a reminder, everyone, that the My Personal Wellbeing Test is available in your handouts pane to download, as well from the Talking About website. So think about how you have been feeling over the past week. Do the test, rate yourself on a scale from 1 to 10, 1 being the lowest and 10 being the highest. So a question, Wendy, could you supply, can you supply the source of the statistics given in your presentation earlier?
Yes, there are various sources, and I can make those available. If you'd like to contact me through the email on the website, I can get those sent out to you.
Thanks, Wendy. Another question, what are some of the most common capital investments for mental health support?
Capital investments, I can't really answer that definitively, but generally for people with mental health conditions, the process to make reasonable adjustments in the workplace can be a lot less onerous than they can for physical disability. As I mentioned, sometimes it's restructuring how the work is delivered, simple tasks, breaking tasks down into smaller bites rather than an overall task, maybe providing a quieter workspace for somebody to get them through. And again, it will depend on each and every person, but you'll generally find that the adjustments that need to be made require very little capital outlay.
Thank you, Wendy. There's still time to submit questions to Wendy French via your control panel, on your window on the control panel. So a couple of comments that have come in. Wendy, thank you for your presentation. We'll pass on info at our next OH&S meeting. And also, Wendy's presentation was incredible. Thank you very much for sharing this information and the way you communicated this information too.
Oh, thank you.
So probably just further to the previous question, Wendy, some employers just care about money. Therefore, where can I find the investment return of an Australian dollar for every dollar invested in work health and safety?
It's a PricewaterhouseCoopers report. So if you just Google PricewaterhouseCoopers, and I can't remember the actual name of the report, but if you just Google return on investment, workplace mental health and safety, PricewaterhouseCoopers, that will bring up the study and the report for you. And some of those other statistics are listed in that report as well. And again, on that, sometimes employers do feel that, oh, well, it's not a necessary thing, but you can develop a business case to take to your employer. And that can be, you know, and again, that's a whole other workshop, implementing a workplace policy. But some of the areas that you might gain data, looking at your absenteeism report, what's your staff turnover report like, absenteeisms. You might also look at the workers' compensation claims. Have you had a lot of workers' compensation around stress claims? Looking at what that's actually cost. Build a business case that actually speaks to the bottom line, because until people really realise the full effect, sometimes the old hip pocket nerve can do the talking.
Thanks, Wendy. How much can you ask a staff member before it starts crossing the privacy line?
Yeah, again, it's an individual thing, really, case by case, which is why I always say be curious about your people and don't wait till it becomes a negative conversation to find out what's going on with them. We have to respect people's privacy and the fact that under law, an employee isn't obliged to disclose if they do have a mental health condition, unless that criteria is unless there is a risk to themselves or other people's safety, or either from the illness itself, the medications, or other factors, or where in knowledge that they have an existing condition, they know that the work that they're doing, the workplace, or the work that they're required to do runs a risk of exacerbating that condition, then they have a legal obligation to disclose. You can do it from, I generally find it's best to ask people about what's happening for you. I'm concerned. You might let people know what you've seen or what you've heard or what you've noticed that gives you cause for concern in the workplace. And again, the earlier you jump on these conversations, the less negative those conversations will become. Letting them know that you're coming from a position of care. Is there anything underlying that, any health condition that they'd like to share with you that might be making things difficult that you might be able to help with? But other than that, you can't really probe for too much detail if the person isn't willing to give it. But again, reassuring them that you're coming from that position of care, that you want to support, you want to help, that can overcome quite often some of those, some reticence around sharing that information, and also knowing that that information will remain confidential. The information that they share with you can only be used for the purposes that they share it. It can't be shared more broadly. So letting people know that. And again, this is where having a policy and making that freely available to people, talking about it regularly, making people aware of what that policy involves, often gives that sense of assurance that, we've got this and it is an okay thing to talk about.
Thanks, Wendy. If someone asks to finish work early, am I able to ask why?
Yes, yep, certainly. You can ask why. If they have a medical appointment, would they like to talk about it? And again, it's up to them whether they will or they won't. But yes, certainly you're allowed to ask questions as to why. Can I ask why? That's a fairly reasonable and legitimate question to ask.
Thanks, Wendy. And just to remind everyone, today's webinar has been recorded and will be made available on the WorkSafe Tasmania website. And also a reminder about the My Personal Wellbeing Test, available for download and also available from the My Training website. Sorry, the Talking About Training website, apologies.
It's Friday.
So with no further questions coming through, Wendy, I'll start to close today's webinar.
Great.
So,
thank you, Susan.
So thank you, Wendy French, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar, Creating a Mentally Healthy Workplace Starts With You. What, why, and how. Once you do leave today's webinar, you will receive a survey. We do appreciate you providing us with your feedback. Today's webinar has been recorded and will be made available on the WorkSafe Tasmania YouTube channel. On behalf of WorkSafe Tasmania and the WorkCover Tasmania Board, thank you for joining us, and thank you, Wendy.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.